Bueno, muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches a todos, dependiendo de la parte del mundo en que se encuentren. Bienvenidos a esta segunda mesa de la discusión sobre la estrategia y táctica de los socialistas ante el capitalismo globalizado de hoy. Esta es la segunda mesa y en esta ocasión les quiero presentar a los que van a presentar sus trabajos. En primer lugar, Radhika Desai, una investigadora muy reconocida sobre las relaciones imperialistas en el día de hoy. Su trabajo se llama La senilidad del capitalismo o la declinación del imperialismo, de la Universidad de Manitoba, Canadá. En segundo lugar, Cliff Durand, del Centro para la Justicia Global, que tiene su sede en México, que va a hablar sobre el nuevo imperialismo en el sistema global del capital transnacional. En tercer lugar, al maestro Sergio Hernández, de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, sobre la validez de las tesis establecidas en el Manifiesto Comunista de 1848, el día de hoy, y Alexander Buzgalin, de la Universidad Estatal de Moscú, Rusia, que nos va a hablar sobre las contradicciones del imperialismo desde la perspectiva de Rusia. Entonces, sin más, comenzamos. Organizamos este panel con la idea de hacer un breve resumen, lo más breve posible, de lo que presentamos la vez pasada. Esto con la idea de que se sume a las presentaciones de hoy y hagamos una discusión general y una propuesta final sobre cómo avanzar en estas discusiones y en esta lucha contra el imperialismo. Entonces, en primer lugar, Marco Gómez habló sobre algunas hipótesis sobre la estrategia y táctica global de los socialistas en el contexto de la sociedad capitalista global actual. Perdón. En una discusión que tuvimos con el Centro de la Justicia Global, veíamos la importancia que tenía la guerra de Afganistán y el hecho de Estados Unidos de abandonar esta guerra con quizás muchos aspectos, pero que un aspecto central parecía ser poder concentrar todos sus esfuerzos en la lucha de competencia con China, tanto desde el punto de vista económico y social como desde el punto de vista militar también. Entonces, consideramos que era muy importante desarrollar toda una discusión acerca de cuál era el contexto actual del imperialismo mundial para para proponer alguna estrategia y táctica por parte de los socialistas a nivel mundial. Dentro de ese plan, la propuesta sobre la base de una serie de hipótesis, no como una propuesta ya hecha, se hacía una serie de planteamientos sobre la necesidad de centrar la lucha contra las guerras de intervención imperialistas, las bases militares y toda forma de guerra económica y de guerra contra el terrorismo y de supuestas guerras para detener las drogas, etcétera. Que era muy importante una lucha contra la violencia en general, contra los migrantes, contra el tráfico de personas, perdón, no de personas, contra el tráfico de drogas, contra todo tipo de violencia, contra las mujeres, por la erradicación del patriarcalismo, después toda una serie de planteamientos sobre la necesidad de democratizar las instituciones globales y por otra parte, medidas de regulación sobre el capital imperialista y el capital global, la regulación del capital financiero, la lucha contra el régimen de patentes que asegura los grandes monopolios mundiales, la lucha contra la especulación, contra los paraísos fiscales, la lucha contra el capitalismo extractivo, una serie de planteamientos sobre cómo regular la estructura fiscal mundial, el planteamiento de la creación de una estructura fiscal mundial, la posibilidad de estructuración de una moneda global y de un sistema financiero público mundial, contra todas las formas de expoliación de la naturaleza, muy centrada en las empresas transnacionales y por lo tanto en el imperialismo, y luego algunas ideas sobre la lucha de los trabajadores, algunas cuestiones que tienen que ver con la reducción de la jornada laboral, contra la carrera hacia abajo en las condiciones laborales, de estándares, de salarios, etcétera, de la educación pública, todas estas cuestiones, por una carrera hacia arriba en cuanto a todos los derechos de los trabajadores, toda una discusión sobre la legislación laboral actual en el mundo que incluya a los trabajadores, tanto urbanos como rurales, informales como informales, y que considere el problema de los migrantes a nivel global, la cuestión de el fomento de todas formas de economía social, cooperativas, comunas, redes globales, etcétera, y finalmente por la libre organización de los trabajadores de acuerdo a sus intereses, a sus necesidades, en sindicatos, en toda clase de otro tipo de organizaciones gremiales, y también la posibilidad y la necesidad de la organización de los trabajadores en partidos políticos. Luego, en segundo lugar, habló Betsy con el título de El imperialismo global y la dominación económica y militar de Estados Unidos. Entonces, Betsy se basa mucho en la idea de Michael Hudson de que el dominio del dólar de Estados Unidos en la economía mundial garantiza al imperialismo de Estados Unidos apropiarse de una parte de la riqueza creada por otras naciones, una especie de tributo. El imperialismo de Estados Unidos mantiene un sistema militar colonizador y una amenaza nuclear permanente para conservar el dominio del dólar. El dominio mundial del dólar ha sido cuestionado en varias ocasiones, la más reciente expresada en la Organización de Shanghái para la Cooperación, y subraya pues que sobre la base de estas rivalidades que están estallando, el gobierno y el imperialismo norteamericano prepara toda una ofensiva política, económica y militar global. Después, Bob plantea con el título de La época del homicidio y la idea sartreana de la humanidad integral. Bob plantea que la estrategia socialista consiste en salvar a la humanidad de lo que él llama homicidio, que consiste en una normatividad, una moralidad alienada basada en la superexplotación y colonización militar por parte del dominio imperialista mundial, que lleva a la doble situación actual de la amenaza de la guerra nuclear y la devastación ecológica. Utiliza una idea de Sartre desarrollada en los años 60 que plantea la necesidad de una ética contraria de la humanidad integral, basada en el lema de cada quien según su capacidad, a cada quien según sus necesidades. Y un llamado que va dirigido a la humanidad entera y no solo a la clase obrera. Él plantea cómo el Internet se ha mostrado como un instrumento capaz de sostener esta nueva ética de la humanidad integral y sostiene que las empresas recuperadas y estos otros experimentos de cooperativización son un modelo de la posibilidad de producirse a sí mismo según sus necesidades. Después planteó Andrés Ruggeri en su ponencia nuevas modas de la acumulación del capital para la explotación del trabajo y señala que este encuentro, dentro del cual estamos llevando a cabo esta mesa, esta mesa está dentro del espíritu del encuentro de reconstruir una alternativa al capital, no solo teórica, sino práctica. Él subraya que en este mundo actual ninguna corriente del pasado le ha ido bien. Tanto los anarquistas, marxistas, las tendencias de liberación nacionales, todos han tenido sus problemas y sus retrocesos. Él piensa que uno de los problemas centrales es haber confundido la noción de poder con la administración del Estado. Y plantea 3 cuestiones o acuerdos a los que sería importante llegar. En lo concreto, la caracterización de la etapa actual del capitalismo, primero. Segundo, los modos en que el capitalismo acumula actualmente para tratar de entender la transformación del trabajo. Ve estos modos como la acumulación financiera en el planeta, la acumulación por desposesión, y replantear en tercer lugar el sujeto revolucionario, en donde él dice que hay 3 tipos de relaciones laborales en el mundo, como 3 grandes sectores. Plantea por un lado el sector de las relaciones salariales, todo un sector, segundo sector, el sector de los trabajadores no asalariados, que abarca a los trabajadores informales, serviles, etcétera, así llamados. Y en tercer lugar, un sector de trabajadores que intenta organizar sus propias formas de trabajo. Él plantea que estos sectores no asalariados, sin embargo, no son un sector excluido, sino que forman parte de la economía capitalista, forman parte de los circuitos de producción de las grandes empresas. Lo que plantea es la necesidad, pues, de sobre estas nuevas realidades, replantear la estrategia, considerando las formas actuales del capitalismo, del imperialismo y de la clase obrera. Por último, Enrique plantea en su ponencia la concepción zapatista de la lucha por la emancipación. Entonces, en primer lugar, plantea que la izquierda desconfía del zapatismo, pero tampoco cree que el socialismo es el único camino a seguir. No todos los caminos transitan por el marxismo-leninismo. Y luego se pregunta, ¿es el zapatismo una variedad del anarquismo? Y responde que, aunque reconocen la crítica anarquista al Estado, el zapatismo quiere superar esta disputa entre anarquistas y marxistas. Plantea que el zapatismo es la reacción de la época de la transición de lo que los zapatistas llaman de la Tercera a la Cuarta Guerra Mundial, expresada por el neoliberalismo, el neodespojo, y que es un intento, además de superar los clichés del marxismo soviético. Se basa en las experiencias del poder popular antisistémico, en donde aparecen muchas formas, desde los caracoles, la comuna, los soviets y otras formas de experiencia. Son experiencias todas opuestas a la ganancia, y no solamente o reducidos a cooperativas ni aldeas autónomas. Son realistas para el mundo urbano, lo son en cuanto a tres principios: mandar obedeciendo, un mundo en donde quepan muchos, para todos todo, nada para nosotros. Y bueno, y finalmente se hizo una discusión general entre algunos de estos tópicos que sería interesante continuar con esta discusión que se presenta el día de hoy. Bueno, ese era el resumen. La idea es ahora la presentación de 20 minutos de cada uno de nuestros ponentes actuales y luego una discusión general y conclusiones. Entonces, por favor, Radhika, empezamos contigo. Yo les voy a señalar cuando falten 5 minutos, ¿ok? Adelante, Radhika.
Thank you so much, Marco, and thank you to Marco, Cliff, and the Center for Global Justice for inviting me, for holding this very exciting event. Already I can tell from what Marco has narrated about the previous events that we are in for a really interesting set of discussions. As Marco said, the title of my talk is The Senility of Capitalism and the Decline of Imperialism. And this diagnosis is based on the approach that I take to world affairs, which I call geopolitical economy. So let me begin by recalling how in the decades since going back to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which was a landmark event in modern history. When that happened, there were clearly two very dominant expectations in the world economy, that people expected about the world, how the two ways in which the world would change. One was that there would be a unipolarity under a sort of benign American hegemony, and secondly, that the world would enjoy a peace dividend. Neither expectation was fulfilled. We can certainly say that looking back from 30 years down the road. A peace. Instead, what we have seen is a steady decline and mounting aggression of the United States as the center of the world economy has moved to the West. So instead of unipolarity, we got what is generally called multipolarity, although which I have increasingly taken to calling pluripolarity. And on the other hand, instead of a peace dividend, we have seen increasing American aggression, which is ever more desperate because it is trying to compensate for the loss of economic primacy through economic means. So, however, despite the fact that these developments were occurring for a long time, they tended to be denied. Instead, the world continued to be understood and theorized in terms of ideas such as globalization and American hegemony and empire. And they tried to, the people who expound these views, they tried to manfully account for the new developments, which increasingly did not fit their paradigms. After 2008 in particular, and in particular after the 2015 election of Donald Trump, these views have become hard to maintain. Increasingly, we hear talk of deglobalization, and of course, with Obama's pivot to Asia and Trump declaring a new Cold War on China, it became very increasingly clear that whatever whatever it was that people used to call American hegemony and American empire, was certainly in decline. So, and by the time of the pandemic and the completely shambolic performance of the United States and many other leading neoliberal capitalist societies against the pandemic, and the comparatively far better performance of China and many other socialist countries, has given people a lot to think about. So clearly, our understanding of world affairs is dominated by ideas that cannot explain developments that are ongoing. Clearly, something better is needed. Now, in 2015, I proposed a different way of understanding matters in a book I published called Geopolitical Economy. And in this work, I proposed a new approach to understanding world affairs, which I showed was deeply rooted in the work of Marx and Engels. And this is very important because very substantial parts of sections among Marxists tend to think of Marx as a theorist of something called globalization. They read the first parts of the Communist Manifesto and say, you see, Marx foresaw globalization. That the idea is kind of practically a Thomas Friedmanite idea. The world is flat. Increasingly, we are going to see the confrontation of class versus class. Nations don't matter. What I show in Geopolitical Economy is that Marx was, although he didn't, as you know, Marx's work remained incomplete, although, and what he did manage to finish focused very centrally, admittedly, on class issues, but he also wrote an enormous amount, and it is very clear when you look at this, that actually Marx considered both class and nation as equally important agents of history. And I would say equally important agents that would bring about the transition from capitalism to socialism. So what Geopolitical Economy does is it puts class and nation side by side in our understanding of capitalism itself, capitalism operating at a world scale. And therefore, this also goes in against much of what calls itself Marxism, that tends to accept what I call the cosmopolitan view of the world, as embodied in views such as globalization and empire, and previously in the 19th century, the British-sponsored free trade paradigm. So these cosmopolitan views, I believe, are profoundly wrong. Marx and Engels and many of their followers knew they were profoundly wrong, and it's high time that we revise them. One of the ways I have of putting this and explaining this very simply is that in views like free trade and globalization, no state matters. In views such as empire and US hegemony, only one state matters. But the division of the world into a multitude of different states, each of them, even if you look at the category of capitalist countries, they each are very different. Swedish capitalism is very different from Japanese capitalism, and that's very different from French, and that's very different from English, and even English and American capitalisms are quite different. So that's the according to globalization and free trade view, no state matters. According to the American hegemony view, only one state matters. But the reality is we live in a world that is divided into nation states as a result of capitalism. That is to say, and we can discuss this further. In this talk, I can only give you a broad flavor of my views. But the division of the world into a multitude of nation states has come about as a result of capitalism itself. So, to return to my talk, what I argue in Geopolitical Economy, I make essentially three arguments. I make three arguments that are the following. The first is what I call the materiality of nations thesis. This idea is directly pitted against cosmopolitan notions in which states don't matter, the plurality of states don't matter. And by the way, in doing so, I'm also pitting it against much of what calls itself Marxist economics, because for a variety of reasons that I have explored in many articles, they tend to take this cosmopolitan view of the world, and essentially they kind of surreptitiously bring in what is basically neoclassical economics, neoliberal economics into Marxism, and this is a big problem. Against that, I insist that, in fact, and I show that Marx and Engels thought, and it is historically accurate to think that actually nation states are very, very critical. They are materially very important in shaping the economy, of shaping the world economy. So in this, then, what the idea that, or let me rephrase that, in this kind of world, what drives the logic, what is the logic of relations between countries, is what Trotsky used to call uneven and combined development. And again, here, I have my own interpretation of this, because most Marxists don't even use the term uneven and combined development. And then among those who do use the term, they confine themselves to talking about uneven development, which means essentially, according to them, that imperialism is some kind of an eternal and unchanging, and if it changes at all, it is an ever-strengthening force, etc., etc. So that's a second category. A third category, they do use the term combined development, but they confine it to refer to countries that are sort of skipping historical stages, like, you know, Russia went from feudalism to socialism, that sort of thing, or Mozambique tried to do that, or what have you. Nicaragua, Cuba, etc., trying to do that. That's what is theorized as combined development. But it's only in geopolitical economy that you will find an interpretation of combined development that I have shown is more accurate in terms of world history, and also more faithful to the ideas of Marx, Engels, and the classical theorists of Marxism, whether it be Lenin or Trotsky and many others. So according to this conception of uneven and combined development, uneven development certainly consists of the attempt to impose imperialism, but combined development is the perennial, long-standing effort to resist this. And the early phases of this resistance actually created other quite strong capitalist states. So, for example, in my view, the first country to develop, of course, to industrialize, was Britain. It was the home of the first industrial revolution. But when Germany, the United States, Japan challenged British dominance, then what you got was essentially that they challenged British dominance by pursuing state-directed protectionist forms of development that were very clear about the politics and the political economy involved in British dominance. So they rejected British dominance, they rejected free trade views of the world and saying this is all very convenient for Britain. What we need is protection, we need state direction, that's how we are going to industrialize. So combined development consists of this. It includes Soviet and Chinese forms of socialist combined development, which also involved essentially managing your country's external relations in order to produce a conducive environment for industrialization, the development of the productive forces, etc., etc. And it also includes less successful but equally important attempts of other third world countries, which have achieved less, but they are nevertheless important to pursue autonomous development. So this is what I call combined development, and the history of combined development goes all the way from the middle and late 19th centuries up until today, when we are talking about China, the BRICS, and so on and so forth. So in this context, essentially dominant countries in the world seek to impose, seek to preserve, create and maintain their dominance in part by subordinating other economies, and they subordinate other economies precisely because capitalism has profound contradictions. That is to say, the idea that any capitalism can function on its own without having an outside in which to externalize its consequences, this does not work. So if I may just briefly share another screen and show you, I guess that will do. Yes. Okay. So here you will see that capitalism has an, we talk about the crisis of capitalism. By the way, the notion of Marx's notion of contradictions and crisis in capitalism also tends to be written out of much of what passes for Marxist economics. But in my view, in some of my recent writings, I have shown that not only are there the the very characteristic contradictions that affect what I call the core realms of value creation, because capitalism is essentially value creation, namely production and realization. But they also emerge because capitalism involves a whole load of other realms: money, finance, the state, the relations between states, and of course its relations with nature or ecology. In every one of these realms, capitalism generates contradictions, and they take two forms. They can take the intra-class form, which emerged from the logic of competition among capitals, and they can take an inter-class form that emerged from the logic of class struggle. So in this way, you can see that there are a very great variety of capitalist crises, and managing these crises is one of the key reasons for is one of the key reasons for the materiality of nations, because nations must manage the contradictions, and a key part of managing this contradiction is to externalize them, that is to say, to impose the consequences of those contradictions. I'm nowhere near done. Hang on. Okay. I think I'm at 14 minutes. Yeah. And I'll try to finish it, but yeah. Okay. So, let me just continue. So basically, uneven development, dominant countries try to impose complementarity between their high value production and the low value production of poor countries, the subordinated countries. But some subordinated countries, or some countries that face or are threatened with subordination, will react, and they will engage in what I call combined development, which seek to impose relations of complementarity. Now, for want of time, I'm going to be very brief about the rest of the theoretical part and go on to the other part, the historical part. So essentially, then the second thesis is that it is not spreading markets that have spread productive capacity around the world, not successive hegemonies of one power after another, like the Dutch and the British and the Americans and so on, but rather the spread of combined development, which takes the form of pluripolarity. And it also means that while the temporary dominance of the first industrial power was more or less inevitable, it was temporary. And by the time the United States came along to try to recreate and try to emulate the sort of dominance that Britain once enjoyed, it was impossible for it to do so. So American hegemony was in fact impossible, and it was impossible even though the Americans pared down their mimetic ambition, their ambition to imitate Britain, by saying we're going to settle for making the dollar the world's money. We're not going to try to create a large empire of the sort that Britain had. It was not possible. And the third thesis is that the reason why cosmopolitan ideas persist is because these are the ideas that favor the ruling classes. Favor the dominant countries. The dominant countries want the rest of the world to be opened up to their commodities, their capital, etc., etc. We can discuss this. So, in the remaining time, I'd just like to very quickly tell you what this means for how we view the evolution of the world economy. So, essentially, obviously, Britain industrialized first. Inevitably, it ended up exercising a form of domination over the rest of the world. When Britain industrialized, it was the age of the first industrial revolution, which had its homeland in Britain, and it was characterized by small firms, competition, light technology, relatively low financial needs, and a parliamentary and competitive relation between capital and the state. Soon, however, the age of this of British dominance and even of the first industrial revolution came to an end when the contender powers such as the United States, Germany, Japan, and a few others attempted to try to challenge British dominance. Countries like Germany, the US, and to a lesser extent Japan did succeed. And this contender challenge was based on what we may call the second industrial revolution, that was based on larger firms, on monopoly or oligopoly, heavy technology and machinery, heavy financial needs, and more or less direct relations between capital and the executive of the state. So this moment already had made the world pluripolar. by the 1870s onwards, they began to challenge British industrial dominance. And this moment has been classically analyzed by the classical Marxist writers on imperialism, whether you think of Hilferding or Lenin or Bukharin or Luxemburg, etc. They analyzed it as something new or something persisting, but nevertheless, they emphasized the elements of monopoly capital, finance capital, that is to say, a form of industrial capital that subordinates finance to itself, and also nationalized capitalism, something that Karl Polanyi would later call the era of crustacean nations, nations with a hard shell. And the interesting thing is that the homelands of this more advanced form of capitalism was no longer Britain. It was these other countries that Hilferding saw as the lands of what he called finance capital. What was distinct, and my argument is that in this moment, the moment before 1914, is the peak of both capitalism and imperialism. And the reason for it is as follows. Marx had already anticipated, and I'm going to confine myself for the moment to Hilferding because the financial aspects are what I focus on. Hilferding and others analyzed this. Essentially, what Marx anticipated and what these people understood of the capitalism of their time is that it had completed the historically progressive function that Marx had given to capitalism, which was to socialize labor. You have to socialize labor. Initially, the labor was socialized between firms, and then later on in the age of monopoly capitalism, massive and intricate forms of socialization of labor took place within giant firms. Having arrived at this point, brutally and chaotically, capitalism had exhausted its historical utility. And this was also the moment, as Hilferding particularly emphasized, when capital had also managed in its advanced forms in Germany, for example, but not in the UK, to subordinate inherited forms of capital, like the financial, to its own logic, so that financial capital was supposed to further develop the expansion of production. And Hilferding is very clear. By contrast, Britain is laden down with a form of finance which can only constrict production. It is not capable of financing, meeting the huge investment needs of the new forms of capital, etc. And it can only engage in worldwide speculation and short-term financial activity, which was, of course, the basis of the sterling system. So essentially, British finance was backward, and according to Hilferding and according to Marx, this type of capital financial capital would have exited from history. However, it did not, because the United States, by the early 20th century, had become committed to emulating UK dominance. I should also add one other thing, which is that financial capital, which is that at this particular point in history, many people expected that the future development would essentially involve taking capitalism in the direction of socialism. There was only, however, one fly in this ointment, which is the American commitment to keeping capitalism liberal, to in fact taking it back from the point it had reached in countries such as Germany and even the United States itself to some form of kind of early industrial capitalism, particularly under finance. This is a more complex story, which I don't have time to go into. But basically what you then get is that from the 1970s onwards, when the United States essentially breaks the link between the dollar and gold, is that the dollar essentially becomes dependent on an ever-expanding financialization or a series of financializations denominated in the dollar, which increase the demand for the dollar and therefore keep the dollar as the world's currency. And so in order to achieve this, the United States had to take its financial sector, which at this point was quite of a productive sort, of the sort Hilferding called finance capital, and change it back to a British-style plundering, speculative, unproductive type of financial capitalism. nevertheless, so we have, what we have seen is a sort of attempt to try to recreate an older form of capitalism, particularly over the neoliberal decades, but that has failed. So what has the history of capitalism shown us? It has shown us that the most, so there was a peak at the beginning of the 20th century, and if it was the case that we saw a massive productive expansion of capitalism in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, it was because at this time, capitalism took over a number of key socialistic measures from socialist countries and so on, and essentially surrounded its capital with it, and therefore these socialistic measures, the welfare state, Keynesian demand management, capital controls, increased management of trade, all of these things enable capitalism to have its golden age. When that fell into crisis, and essentially capitalist countries decided that these socialistic measures had been the problem after all, and they went over to neoliberalism, what we have seen is 40 years in which capitalism's senility has been demonstrated time and time again. So today we have a capitalism in which growth, investment, both growth and investment are low. There is over competition, therefore there's always huge pressure on margins, which then gets translated as pressure on wages, etc. Very relatively low productivity growth, the generation of employment which is inadequate both in quality and quantity, and also productive limits. That is to say, increasingly capital seems to be capable of only producing what can be offered by a senile capitalism, not what is needed by people. And I'll end on this note because time is up. But I will say that basically, instead of thinking of imperialism as something that is constantly renewed by each new successive power, what my thesis implies is that imperialism sort of reached a peak before 1914, when all these powers, Britain and the contender powers, competed for economic territory, colonies, markets, etc. From that peak, it has slowly, essentially drifted downwards. The options of the imperialist powers have constantly diminished, and nowhere is this more clear than in the fact that the United States today, despite its massive investment in expanding its own imperial power, has in fact had to retreat ignominiously from Afghanistan, and that has only capped a long series of military failures, despite the fact that the United States spends astronomical amounts of money on its military. It has not a single military victory to show for itself. It has destroyed a great deal in its attempts to achieve military victories, but it has not achieved one. So I'm sorry for having taken too long. I hope I've given you some things at least to think about, and I look forward to the discussion.
Radhika, thank you very much. It's a very complex theme. We hope to continue this discussion, and then at the end you will have a few minutes to resume, make a conclusion. Okay, so the next, please, Cliff, will you present your talk, yes, please?
Okay, thank you. Marcos, one suggestion. Can you highlight or spotlight the speakers so that our screen is filled with them? I mean, Radhika was just a little tiny square on my screen. If she had been spotlighted, she would fill the whole screen. We don't need to see all of these other little squares. It's the speaker that should be spotlighted. Just a suggestion. Well, as Marcos said in his introduction, the discussion between the Center for Global Justice and his group in Mexico City started during the US and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so let me begin my presentation with that, because that was a clear recognition that the nation-building project that the US had undertaken in Afghanistan had failed. It was a defeat for US imperialism. This is in no small measure the doing of Donald Trump, of all people. He has been our only anti-imperialist president. From his withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which a nationalist progressive alliance had turned the public against, to his weakening of NATO and undermining the multilateral Atlantic alliance that had given the US dominance, Trump's America First agenda has weakened US imperialism. This is one of the ironic twists of history, or the cunning of the world spirit, if you will. The genius of Trump's surrender in Afghanistan is that Biden has had to pay the political cost. Unfortunately, politicians and the media are focused on the messy exit rather than the larger lessons of the 20 years of failure. No defeated army can retreat in a graceful manner. Biden should be congratulated for his courage in biting the bullet and following the popular opposition to this long war. This should be an opportunity to make a deeper criticism of US foreign policy. Some have seen it as a turn to a non-interventionism by the US. I doubt that, however. What we have seen since 9/11 is the unraveling of the neocons' project for a new American century, associated with Dick Cheney and that circle of neoconservatives. Their view had become the unspoken basis for our national security strategy after the new Pearl Harbor of 9/11. Taking advantage of the unipolar world after the end of the Cold War, the US was to secure its military dominance in every region by preventing the rise of any competing power. That's what gave us 20 years of war and instability in the Middle East. While that is now seen to be a fool's errand, the unwillingness to accept a multipolar world still informs US policy. Witness Biden administration's hostility to China and Russia. But digging deeper yet, we need to critique the taken for granted idea of American exceptionalism. This is the view that as a new nation, we have a unique position as a model for the world, a city on a hill. This gives us the responsibility to remake the world. It is what gave us the grand project in the years since World War II, to rebuild the world according to a capitalist model. This goes back to the Roosevelt administration's planning for the post-war period, in which the US would be in a unique position to build back better. This has been insightfully analyzed in the late Leo Panitch and Sam Ginden's study, The Making of Global Capitalism. I would maintain that corporate-led neoliberal globalization is the new imperialism that will be with us long after the wars have ended. Wars are the most visible face of militarized imperialism by state actors. But we should not overlook the economic face that has become even more important in today's globalized world. Corporate-led neoliberal globalization has established dominance by transnational corporations over many countries. This leads to political domination over national governments, exploitation of their workers, rape of natural resources, and destruction of the petty bourgeoisie by competition from commercial monopolies. And the dominance of transnational capital over national governments has really transformed what were once appropriately called nation states into what might more appropriately be called globalized states, states that are serving the interests not of their nations, but of transnational capital. The U.S. has been the chief sponsor of this globalization since the end of World War II. Many of the wars we have seen have been to establish capitalism in countries that sought to build a different future for themselves. A few have succeeded. Cuba and Venezuela still struggled to hold on to their non-capitalist sovereignty, but most were defeated and have been brought into the global capitalist system. While the U.S. state has sponsored and defended this capitalist project, it has not been in promotion of its own narrow national interests. For example, the Marshall Plan restored capitalism to Europe, even though that created a competitor to U.S. capital. Similarly, over the last 50 years, U.S. policies have encouraged U.S. corporations to globalize, investing offshore and shifting jobs abroad. As transnational corporations, rather than national corporations, there are few benefits to the working class. Indeed, the middle class had been built under the welfare liberalism of the New Deal decades, but has now been undermined, and as a result is joining the radical right. This is the domestic consequence of the new imperialism of global capitalism. With the development of a global capitalist system, there is evolving an apparatus for its governance. At first, created by powerful states like the U.S. and its allies, it is gradually developing powers of its own, with regulatory financial institutions, elements of a judicial system, police powers to maintain order, and even governance institutions, as we will see. There is already a transnational financial system with a deep financial integration of transnational corporations through stocks and mergers, like the $3.5 trillion co-investments between China and the US. Banks are no longer national in scope, but operate around the world, following the global assembly lines and distribution chains that developed starting nearly 50 years ago. To facilitate the flow of value between nations with different currencies, the US dollar has functioned as a global currency protected by the Treasury Department. This has given the US state considerable power to pursue its parochial interests unrestrained by capital. It is this defect in the transnational financial system that has led to efforts to create an alternative global reserve currency. It is a system that still evolves in a way more suitable, that is still evolving in a way more suitable for global capitalism. Bilateral trade agreements typically include mechanisms for adjudication of disputes between investors, aka corporations, and states. These investor-state dispute settlement bodies, as they're called, ISDS, have the power to penalize states whose policies affect the profits of foreign corporations, even though they protect the environment or health or safety of people. These panels usually find in favor of the corporations. They are hardly impartial adjudication bodies. They are judicial bodies designed to protect capital. As sponsors of global capitalism, the U.S. has also been its chief protector. As globalization theorist William I. Robinson points out, quote, the U.S. state wields the only significant instruments of coercion on a world scale. The transnational state that is in formation does not have a coercive apparatus that is truly supranational. End quote. Thus, the U.S. military is being volunteered as a world police force, particularly with the Biden administration's move away from invasion of countries toward a strategy of drone warfare and special operations against specific targets to ensure security. These are likely to become increasingly like police SWAT teams, only operating on a global scale. Just as transnational corporate capital has sought to build its own judicial systems through trade agreements that include ISDS, it is getting its own police force as well. While a global state does not yet exist, elements of its apparatus do, and the transnational capitalist class aspires to develop it. They do their strategic planning through the World Economic Forum, which meets yearly in Davos, Switzerland. After the near fatal economic collapse in 2008, they saw the need for an international governance system that could manage global capitalism in a way that individual states with their diverse interests could not do. What they called for is remaking the United Nations into not just a body of weakened nation states, but a hybrid corporate government system run by corporate executives in partnership with governments. Not content with having captured national governments, now corporations are aiming for international institutions. Thus, we are developing elements of a global state apparatus to better secure corporate capitalism. Today, imperialism no longer takes its classic form of states competing with one another for the chance for their national capitals to exploit other countries. Now it is transnational corporations that are competing with one another to carry out such exploitation within a single global capitalist system. Transnational corporations, not states, are the agents of imperialism. States are there just to police the game in the interest of the collective capitalism. Robinson, quote, imperialism is not about nations, but about groups exercising their social power through institutions to control the worldwide production of wealth, of value, to appropriate surpluses, and to reproduce these arrangements, end quote. This is why an anti-imperialist strategy today must be more than anti-war. It must be anti-capitalist, and thus it must be socialist. With that strategy, what this strategy should be depends on where a country is in the relations of production of economic imperialists, relations of exploitation of economic imperialism. Different strategies are called for in those with power and those that are neo-colonies. In either case, the field of anti-imperialist struggle is national within the context of an unequal global system.
Cliff, you have 5 minutes, please.
Good. Those nations that are exploited by transnational capital lack effective sovereignty, both politically and economically. This can lead to a revolutionary situation where popular forces can mobilize against corrupt governments that serve foreign interests. This becomes a strategy, a struggle for national liberation. While this is not necessarily socialist, if popular forces are able to take state power and act against imperialism, it can radicalize the revolution in a socialist direction. This is what happened in Cuba after 1959. The process of constructing socialism is a long and arduous process, made all the more difficult by the hostility of capitalism. So too, global capitalism makes this more difficult. The internal class structures of neo-colonies have been made more complex. There have been growing professional managerial classes inserted between workers and peasants at the bottom and foreign capital at the top. These so-called national class, middle classes, a lumpen bourgeoisie, have an interest in imperialism. On the other hand, the situation in an advanced capitalist country like the US is very different. We are not in a revolutionary situation. We don't even have an organized, class-conscious working class. The socialist left does not have a popular base. In fact, as long as workers were able to get a share of the benefits of the exploitation of other countries, they had the consciousness of a labor aristocracy and defended capitalism. This was especially so in the white working class. Neoliberal globalization has now undermined these privileges, resulted in status insecurity among the precariat. As I said above, they have become a recruiting ground for the right and a potential mass base for fascism. That this has happened points to the failure of the left to present an alternative. In the face of this danger, the best hope for progressive change lies in a democratic socialist program that offers a better alternative to the popular classes. This is the way forward that has been championed by Bernie Sanders. Through programs of social benefits for the popular classes that demonstrate that government can work for them, the political elite now hopes to restore its legitimacy. This means a departure from the neoliberal orthodoxy they've been embracing. But this is, if this is even possible, in face of the present dysfunctional political system remains to be seen. But if it is possible, the building of commons can go far toward empowering people with a sense of collective identity that can point in a socialist direction. I'm referring to institutions like universal health care, cooperatives and self-managed enterprises, public goods like parks and transportation and education, etc. These offer people a security and enrichment in their lives, just as Social Security has done. While these are not socialist, they are building blocks of a socialist construction process. We should acknowledge that the right is correct when they attack such programs as socialists. And they are, and we should embrace them as such. They enable us to move away from capitalism. That being said, socialist institutions within a capitalist society will not overcome capitalism. It will only open a socialist horizon in our consciousness. What can bring down capitalism is its own internal contradictions that can lead it to collapse. When it does, we can only hope to be ready with an alternative that will garner popular support. As for ending the new imperialism of transnational capital, that will depend on the revolt of those nations that are victims of its exploitation. That may be countries of the global south, but it also could potentially be the formerly wealthy countries of the north, ravaged by globalization. So far, the latter does not seem likely on its as its precarious working class now turn in a fascist direction instead. We are now at a decisive moment in history, socialism or barbarism. And I will end with what I earlier said is my key point. Global capital is the new imperial power. Thank you.
Sergio, por favor, continúa tú.
Muy bien, muy bien.
¿No?
Gracias.
Eso.
Miren, empiezo por tratar...
¿Perdón, qué?
Empiezo, decía, por tratar de darles una primera idea de lo que me propongo hacer en 20 minutos. Lo que quiero es presentar ante ustedes un esbozo de una hipótesis de trabajo en torno a cuál debería ser la estrategia del proletariado revolucionario en las condiciones actuales. ¿Cómo lograr hacer esto en solo 20 minutos? La solución que se me ocurre es la siguiente. Basarme en un documento que creo es conocido por la gran mayoría de los presentes. Me refiero al Manifiesto Comunista de 1848 de Marx y de Engels. ¿Qué considero que está vigente? ¿Y qué considero que no está vigente? Las ideas estratégicas están contenidas sobre todo en el capítulo 1 y en parte del capítulo 2. Me centraré principalmente en ellas. En el capítulo 1 se discute ante todo el problema de la necesidad histórica para todas las sociedades humanas. En particular, la cuestión de cómo se ha originado la sociedad capitalista contemporánea. El problema de cómo se ha desarrollado hasta mediados del siglo XIX, el de cómo tiende a desarrollarse hasta su hundimiento final y el de cómo ha de surgir de entre las ruinas de tal sociedad la nueva sociedad socialista. Yo me manifiesto fundamentalmente de acuerdo con todas las tesis explícitamente allí expuestas o implícitamente consideradas. Me refiero en particular a la idea de que necesariamente surge y se extiende hasta abarcar a todo el planeta el modo mercantil de producción. Me refiero a la idea de que sobre la base anterior va surgiendo y reproduciéndose sin cesar por todas partes el modo capitalista de producción, implicando con ello el desdoblamiento de la sociedad en dos clases, la clase burguesa y la clase proletaria. También me refiero al reconocimiento del proceso constante y cada vez a un ritmo más rápido de acumulación del capital en todos los países de todos los continentes. Considero también el reconocimiento del fenómeno social consistente en la concentración cada vez más patente del capital y de la producción, y con él en el fenómeno de la formación ineluctable, por un lado, de una pequeñísima élite capaz de apropiarse de la mayor parte del producto de toda la sociedad, y por el otro lado, de una enorme masa de proletarios y de una gigantesca población cada vez más sojuzgada por el capital. En general, todo lo anterior se sintetiza en el proceso necesario de agudización cada vez mayor de la contradicción entre la socialización de la producción y la apropiación privada capitalista de los medios de producción. Estoy convencido de que todos los procesos anteriormente esbozados se desenvolvieron sin cesar durante toda la segunda mitad del siglo XIX. Fueron abriéndose camino, pasando por la Comuna de París de 1871, por la Primera Guerra Mundial, por la Revolución de Octubre, por la Segunda Guerra Mundial, por las revoluciones que le siguieron en Europa Oriental, en China, en el resto de Asia, en África y en América Latina. Me parece que de ningún modo los procesos esbozados anteriormente han perdido su ímpetu, ni con la llamada Guerra Fría, ni tras el hundimiento del llamado campo socialista y de la Unión Soviética. Finalmente, me declaro convencido de que dichos procesos han continuado marchando imparables durante lo que va del siglo XXI y que así seguirán indefinidamente mientras no se transforme la sociedad capitalista actual revolucionariamente en otro tipo de sociedad. En segundo lugar, me manifiesto fundamentalmente de acuerdo con la tesis de que a medida de que se realizan los procesos anteriormente esbozados, determinado por estos y al mismo tiempo proporcionándoles estabilidad, se ha venido dando necesariamente el desarrollo del Estado burgués mundial. Durante el siglo XIX, el mundo se fue poblando de numerosos estados nacionales, tanto en el llamado viejo como en el llamado nuevo continente. De tal modo que si nos olvidamos de los relativamente pocos tratados internacionales, creo que no se comete un error demasiado grave si afirmamos que durante esa época el Estado burgués mundial toma la forma de, entre comillas, la suma de los cada vez más numerosos estados burgueses nacionales. Parafraseando a Marx, es posible que se pueda decir que en ese momento el Estado burgués mundial es nacional por su forma e internacional por su contenido. Sin embargo, y correspondiendo con un proceso cada vez más intenso de socialización de la producción a nivel mundial, durante el siglo XX y sobre todo condicionado por las dos guerras mundiales, el Estado burgués va tomando nuevas formas. Los tratados entre las naciones proliferan y con ello se hace cada vez más complejo el derecho internacional. Bajo la batuta del gran capital financiero, se desarrollan por todo el planeta gigantescas empresas transnacionales, industriales, comerciales y financieras. Poco a poco, y de entre las aterradoras experiencias de las guerras mundiales, surgen compromisos políticos más o menos vinculantes entre un conjunto cada vez más amplio de estados nacionales. En primer lugar, surge la efímera Sociedad de las Naciones, que no soporta y estalla con las contradicciones interimperialistas en las vísperas de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Y al término de esta, surge la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, que desde su nacimiento se ha ido expandiendo sin cesar hasta el punto de que en la actualidad cuenta con casi 200 estados nacionales miembros. Esta institución, con todo el conjunto de funciones que desempeña y que ayudan a estabilizar a la sociedad capitalista contemporánea, es solo una pequeña parte del proceso del surgimiento de un verdadero Estado burgués mundial que trasciende de los estados burgueses nacionales. Es forzoso contar también con la multitud de acuerdos que actualmente comprometen a los diversos estados nacionales y sobre todo contar también con la multitud de pactos militares internacionales, todos los cuales en última instancia van integrando una gigantesca maquinaria cuya función esencial es la protección de la también gigantesca propiedad privada capitalista sobre los medios planetarios de producción. Con respecto al asunto del desarrollo del Estado burgués, creo que es muy importante mencionar aquí la autocrítica que en relación a ello se hacen Marx y Engels después de la Comuna de París. La Comuna, escriben ellos, ha demostrado que la clase obrera no puede limitarse simplemente a tomar posesión de la máquina del Estado tal y como está y servirse de ella para sus propios fines. Basados en la experiencia de ese gran acontecimiento, es sabido que Marx descubre la teoría acerca de la necesidad histórica de la dictadura del proletariado como etapa inicial de la nueva sociedad socialista. Me declaro suscriptor de tal teoría fundamental. Pero existe un punto importante en el cual hoy, en 2021, podemos señalar que claramente el manifiesto de 1848 comete un error de cálculo. Dicho error se revela con gran claridad al finalizar el capítulo 2, que se llama Proletarios y Comunistas. Aquí se concibe la revolución socialista mundial, primero, como un gran acontecimiento relativamente inmediato, e incluso son propuestas 10 medidas a ser llevadas a la práctica en los países más avanzados. Y dos, implícitamente se considera que este acontecimiento ha de tener su motor precisamente en los países más avanzados. En ese momento, en cuanto al desarrollo del modo capitalista de producción. Hoy, 173 años después de la publicación del documento que consideramos, no tiene gran mérito establecer que esas concepciones eran equivocadas. ¿Qué tanto afecta esto a toda la teoría? Veamos primero más de cerca en qué consiste el error. En la visión de Marx y de Engels, la lucha entre la clase obrera y la burguesía es fundamentalmente, entre comillas, un juego de suma cero, un enfrentamiento antagónico. Me parece que aunque haciendo ciertas abstracciones, tal concepción es teóricamente válida, existen ciertas limitaciones para que lo sea en la práctica. ¿En qué consisten tales limitaciones? Me parece que ellas consisten esencialmente en que se está perdiendo de vista al conjunto de las relaciones entre, por un lado, los países de Europa Occidental más desarrollados en el capitalismo y junto con ellos los Estados Unidos, y por el otro lado, la gran masa de los países atrasados del resto del mundo. ¿En qué consisten dichas relaciones? Centralmente en el dominio entre comillas, dominio del Oriente por el Occidente. En el hecho de que una gran cantidad de países atrasados son colonias o semicolonias de los países más desarrollados y de que, por tanto, estos, o mejor dicho, su burguesía, disponen de los recursos naturales y de la mano de obra barata de los países bajo su dominio. Como consecuencia, la lucha entre la clase obrera y la burguesía dentro de los países desarrollados deja de ser, entre comillas, un juego de suma cero y se crea la posibilidad de que a condición de su lucha, el proletariado de tales países pueda alcanzar, entre comillas, de la maraña una hebra. ¿No es entonces, entre comillas, demasiado conflictivo que el Estado burgués desarrolle la educación pública, la salud pública, el seguro social y otras instituciones, y al mismo tiempo que los sindicatos logren ciertas conquistas? Todo lo cual forma las condiciones para que en los países desarrollados se presenten fenómenos como el de la formación de la, entre comillas, aristocracia obrera y el del surgimiento de corrientes cada vez más derechistas en el seno de los partidos obreros de la época. Me parece que lo anteriormente dicho explica a grandes rasgos el error de cálculo de Marx y de Engels. Pero ¿cuáles son los alcances del error considerado? ¿Se derrumba acaso con ello la compleja y profunda teoría desarrollada por los autores mencionados? Por ahora, dadas las prisas, me limito a exponer a grandes rasgos la idea que tengo sobre el asunto. Presentemos entonces un esquema sumamente abstracto de mis conjeturas. Primero, un país relativamente avanzado en el capitalismo y que convierte a otro relativamente atrasado en colonia al viejo modo, obtiene él en su conjunto cierta cantidad de riqueza en la forma de bienes y servicios producto del trabajo de los habitantes del país colonizado. Segundo, igualmente un país capitalista relativamente avanzado que invierte una masa de capitales en otro relativamente atrasado, obtiene de este último también una masa de riqueza producida con el trabajo del país atrasado.
Me quedan 5 minutos.
Tercero,
Sergio.
Sí, gracias. Si un país más o menos desarrollado en el capitalismo ni es explotado por otro en el anterior sentido y tampoco explota a otro, entonces se produce en el interior de su economía un, entre comillas, juego de suma cero entre su burguesía y su proletariado. 4. Por otra parte, en un país explotador, en el sentido anterior, se atenúan las contradicciones entre la burguesía y el proletariado. 5. Consideremos enseguida una nueva situación. Supongamos que el sistema integrado por los dos países A y B, supongamos que el país A es el explotador y que el país B es el explotado. Supongamos enseguida que son abolidas todas las posibles trabas que impiden la competencia entre las clases obreras de A y de B y también entre las burguesías. ¿Qué tiende a ocurrir? Tienden primero a homogeneizarse las ganancias de los capitalistas de ambos países y segundo, a homogeneizarse las condiciones de trabajo de los trabajadores del sistema conjunto A y B. Por tanto, se establece un, entre comillas, juego de suma cero en el sistema unificado, integrado por A y por B. En resumen, no obstante las duras derrotas sufridas por el movimiento obrero revolucionario internacional, y entre paréntesis, creo que una de las más graves ha consistido en el derrumbe de la Unión Soviética y de las llamadas democracias populares de Europa Oriental. No obstante tales duras derrotas, me parece que la sociedad capitalista mundial se desenvuelve en última instancia según las leyes sociales descubiertas ya hace casi 2 siglos por Marx y por Engels. Estoy convencido de que ellos, Marx y Engels, descubrieron las leyes científicas generales acerca de cómo surge y se desarrolla el fruto y de cómo llega a su madurez. Pero creo también que en su calidad de científicos pioneros sobre el tema, hubo una serie de detalles del proceso de maduración que omitieron considerar. Creo que hoy, y no obstante su clara complejidad, la situación se contempla de un modo distinto. Hoy el modo mercantil de producción cubre al 99% de la superficie del planeta y enlaza cada vez más plenamente a todos los países. Hoy surge y se desarrolla espontáneamente por todas partes el modo capitalista de producción. Hoy las grandes empresas transnacionales, industriales, comerciales y financieras cubren y subyugan a todo el mundo e integran un sistema capitalista global cada vez más pleno. En correspondencia con lo anterior, como una superestructura sobre la base antes esbozada, se va integrando ante nuestros ojos un verdadero Estado burgués mundial que trasciende de la mera suma de los estados burgueses nacionales. El proceso está lejos de concluirse. Los estados burgueses nacionales tienen todavía gran importancia, pero la tendencia es evidente. Por todo lo anteriormente dicho, me parece que la lucha de clases entre la gran burguesía y el proletariado internacional tiende a polarizarse cada vez más agudamente. La multitud de sociedades capitalistas nacionales tiende cada vez más rápidamente a integrarse en una sola gran sociedad capitalista planetaria y por lo tanto a convertirse en un solo gran teatro para la lucha de clases entre el proletariado internacional y la burguesía. Se habrá entonces tardado más tiempo del calculado por Marx y por Engels en 1848, pero me parece el fruto avanza hacia madurar en la actualidad a un ritmo cada vez más acelerado. Gracias.
Ok, muchas gracias. Gracias, Sergio. Please, Alexander, can you present your paper or your talk?
Yes, colleagues, hello again, buenos dias. Unfortunately, I can speak only English. Sometimes I can speak also Russian, but not for international conferences, unfortunately. So I want to present you a paper devoted to the contradictions of the modern imperialism of the 21st century. And of course, it will be Russian vision of this topic, very big, complex topic. A small introduction, fun introduction. I understood that in Latin America, you cannot have a good meeting of the colleagues, of friends, of comrades without dancing. In France, I understood that it is impossible to have dinner of friends and colleagues without cheese. In Russia, it is impossible to have a dialogue of academic left people without methodology and deep theory. So I will present you a paper devoted in many aspects to theoretical problems of contradictions of imperialism, but this is at the same time extremely practical questions, which very important consequences for our strategy and tactic. Our, I mean, left forces, social forces, everybody who is fighting for liberation, fighting by different methods and means. It can be political struggle, it can be open battle, it can be academic discussion, but in all spheres you must be brave, decisive, and responsible. So some very important points which I want to stress. As I mentioned, I start with contradictions, and this is dialectic. Unfortunately, even for Marxists, dialectical method became something unusual. Sometimes we can speak about contradictions, but nobody wants to put this in the agenda as special aspect, as special key point of presentation, of analysis, of conclusions, and so on. I want to do this. And if we do this, let's try to remember about fundamental contradiction of every society. I will use old Marxist categories, contradiction between productive forces and production relations. What does it mean for 21st century imperialism? Of course, when I put such question, I made a step from geopolitical economy, sorry, radical, to analysis of social economic relations without national or global context. But then we come to geopolitical contradictions too. So first step, productive forces. Technological development bring us, mankind, all countries, to the level which can be the starting point, not result, but starting point of movement towards production, where man, personality, can be subject of creative labor, not part of machine, industrial production, not part of hand labor in agriculture or in any other sphere, but subject of creativity. For many of us, this means only top level, high level, educated, well-educated intellectuals. But I will argue, even an ordinary person who is working in kindergarten, person who is working in hospital, not as doctor, but as assistant, as, I don't know, in Russia, this is a medical sister or medical brother. Everybody who is working in all spheres of social activity, social work, all real participants of green movement, all subjects of human relations, humanization of relations between people. Everybody are subjects of creativity. And this is up to 30% of population, especially if our teachers, our doctors, our intellectuals will be free from commercialization and bureaucratization. And this is future of mankind. And this is necessary to realize in all countries, not only in rich countries. And it is possible to realize during some decades, not hundreds, not epochs. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit worried and my English is not very well, but I try to do my best. So this is one part of contradiction. Another part of contradiction. Instead of development of such type of technologies, we have something opposite. We have development of deindustrialization, financialization, enormous growth of hand labor in trade, in all forms of service, where we don't have creativity, where we don't have even industrial production, where we have primitive hand labor, reproductive labor, similar with the most terrible forms of labor in pre-industrial epoch, 12th, 15th, maybe 17th century. We are going back, even in developed countries. And the problems of development of personality, all these problems of labor, of education, of healthcare are frozen in the countries of periphery and even semi-periphery. Russia is the portrait. In education, we have bureaucratization and commercialization instead of creativity. In agriculture, we have primitive hand labor, and so on and so forth. And we have growth of primitive industrial labor everywhere. Why? Because we have production relations of imperialism of the 21st century, domination of global transnational capital, and this capital is financial capital, fictitious capital, and this capital is based on the private property, intellectual private property, and intellectual private property now is obstacle for free distribution of modern technologies. Especially this is problem not for intellectuals, it is a problem for peasants, for agriculture, where people in poor countries cannot use modern technologies because of intellectual private property, not because countries are poor. They are poor and this is problem, but this is second problem. So production relations of modern late capitalism are obstacle for the technological progress and especially for the progress of personality. And this is fundamental contradiction which we must take into the account. This is not something only abstract. This is practical problem of everyday life of everybody, from poor peasant to more or less stable with income professor. And this is agenda. But we have not only this contradiction. As a result of contradiction between this development of productive forces and modern production relations, we have contradictions inside production relations, institutions of modern imperialism, of late capitalism. We have global, organized, corporative capital on one hand, and we have different, atomized, with big internal divergence, divergence in English, I don't remember very well, divergence of different forms of labor. I want to stress, what does it mean? We have maybe billion of people who are still working in the spheres of pre-industrial, pre-capitalist relations based on the hand labor, recreative hand labor. They're semi-slaves, not simply wage labor. It is labor of semi-slaves. We have such forms even in Russia, and not only in agriculture, but migrants in constructing workers, in transport, in many other spheres, even in trade, in supermarkets. This is first. And violence, traditions, semi-feudal and simply feudal forms of oppression are the reality for this part of population, very big part of world population. Second, everybody knows, but not everybody stressed, that now industrial working class became main part of working people in the planet. The role, not even the role, but the proportion of industrial working class is bigger than it was in 19th century. And exploitation of this industrial working class in countries of semi-periphery and periphery, where this working class is concentrated, is extremely similar with capitalism of late 19th, early 20th century. It is forms of Marx capital, described in Marx capital. Terrible labor, extremely difficult to create trade union, enormous exploitation, extremely big social differentiation. This is reality of Russia. If you want to organize strike, you will be beaten, you will be in police, you will be in the prison. And this is reality, like in US, when Chicago workers decided to celebrate, not to celebrate, it was then 1st of May Day. So it's the same now in Russia. And Russia is a relatively developed country with big traditions of production. And this is reality. So this is second part. Old style, primitive capitalist exploitation and all these forms of capitalist exploitation in the imperialism of 20th century, not modern imperialism. And finally, we have new trend, very important. We have a creative labor, extremely important part of modern development. We have teachers and doctors as one of the key social stratas for development. We have scientists as one of the key stratas for the development. The same for engineers, specialists in computer technologies, and so on. And this labor, creative labor, is under the new forms of exploitation and determination. I don't have time to describe what does it mean, but here main problem is intellectual private property, what I mentioned before. And as a result of these three levels of subordination of labor and exploitation and alienation, we have three forms of imperialist domination. We have violence, old-style feudal violence, which was typical for pre-capitalist societies, for Roman Empire, for Russian Empire, for, I don't know, Austrian Empire, and so on and so far. We have rebirth of these semi-feudal forms, even in ideology, not only in politics, geopolitics, and economic relations, first. And we have rebirth of traditional forms of oppression. Look on the women who cannot show the face, who cannot receive education without permission of the men. What does it mean? It is 1/2 of the population of big countries. And this is part of the trends inside Europe even. This is not problem of dress or style of life. It is not problem of culture. It is a problem of rebirth of feudalism. So this is first. Second, we have distribution of capitalist exploitation and barbaric methods of imperialism of the early 20th century, described by Rosa Luxemburg, Vladimir Ulyanov, Lenin, and so on. I will not repeat what does it mean. And in Africa, in Asia, even in Russia, we have such forms. In McDonald's restaurants, it is forbidden to create trade union. Only one example. Then we have exploitation and determination and imperialism of the 21st century. And this is mainly through monopolization of technologies, intellectual private property, and the domination of fictitious virtual financial capital. This is new forms of domination. Savings of Russians in dollars. Saving of Indians maybe also in dollars. Even in China, people are trying to calculate dollars in spite of the fact that this is forbidden. And China is a stable country with stable currency, with economic growth and so on. This is not example of periphery. So this is new forms, and I described this with my friend Andrei Kolganov under the supervision of Radica. We prepared a book about global capitalism, but I will not talk about it. I don't want to make advertising. So this is three forms of imperialism, which is modern imperialism, which includes feudal, not even imperialism, but empire methods. Empire methods. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. It includes imperialism of the early 20th century with appropriation through this possession, with all these forms, and modern forms of imperialism. So next step, what we can do in this situation.
You have 5 minutes,
Yes,
Alexander,
this
please.
is 5 minutes for alternatives, unfortunately.
Thank you.
But this is important to show these alternatives. By the way, I prepared the whole paper about this, but now a few minutes. First, again, because of this conservative trend, we have an agenda old slogans of left social democracy. And the so-called left in the United States, like Sanders and Britain and so on, they are, let's say, 80% people with slogans of social democracy of the 60s, 1960s. And this is again in the agenda, free of charge education for everybody, through all life, free of charge healthcare for everybody through all life, progressive income tax 50% for millionaires, and so on and so forth. Plus green agenda. This is well known, this is reforms. But what is important for semi-periphery and periphery countries, these reforms are extremely necessary, and this is for us very difficult target, goal for the struggle. When in Russian parliament, opposition says about not 50, 35, like Trump, 35% on the rich, qualification. You want to make coup d'etat. You're communist revolutionists. You want to destroy our country. You want to destroy all values of the market economy. This is reality of semi-periphery country. 35% on the rich, which is a defeat for US left movement, 35%, and which is impossible in Sweden. In Sweden, right wing of political parties will propose 45, and it will be catastrophe if it is 45, but not 55 like now. I mean, in Scandinavian countries. Scandinavian countries are capitalist countries. It is not paradise. They are imperialist countries, but just as example. Is it possible to have these social democratic reforms in periphery and semi-periphery countries? Yes, it is possible. And this is one of the slogans, but this is first simple minimum step. And in order to make this step, quotation from Lenin, it's necessary to be revolutionary force. Unfortunately, because really this is reformism. But in order to realize these reforms, it's necessary to have revolutionary, energy and to be brave. Second, economy of solidarity in all forms. One of the forms, by the way, free of charge distribution of all know-how, property of everybody on everything in the sphere of culture, information, and so on. Extremely important slogan. This is not, it's possible to have market with absence of intellectual private property, like it is possible to have market and capitalism with social property on the land. It is possible to have market without intellectual private property because it creates rent, not profit, rent. And capitalism can survive without rent. So it is not even anti-capitalist method. Of course, it will undermine all modern capitalism, but mainly it will undermine modern imperialist domination. And this is economy of solidarity. Economy of solidarity in the sphere of creative labor. Second form, extremely well known, all forms of collective organization of property. But I want to stress all forms. And this is very big diversity. And some of them are progressive, some are so-so. And then we have other forms of economy of solidarity, including labor relations, real self-management, because it can be formal cooperative with very bureaucratic management. We have such forms in Russia from time to time, and so on. And finally, we have slogan of communist revolution. And for me, this is the strategic goal, because without qualitative change, we will have more or less reformist, more or less democratic, more or less social, more or less green capitalism. And capitalism is main category, all other is additions. Like, beautiful sauce on bad meat. It's possible to eat bad meat if sauce is not bad, but better to have good meat and then good sauce. So this is the end of my presentation. I didn't have time to say if Russia is an imperialist country. It is an interesting subject. I will give only a quick answer during 30 seconds. Russian elite, Russian corporations together with bureaucracy, they want to be imperialist, but they have very few resources for this. That's why really they cannot do this in 90% of the cases. Only in some spheres, in some countries around Russia, maybe sometimes a little bit in Africa, a little bit in Syria, a little bit in other regions, but still influence of Russia as imperialist country is very weak. Ambitious we have, not we like people, but we as establishment. And this is a very important contradiction. Please take this into the account, because ambitions, slogans, propaganda is extremely overestimating real danger, real forces, and real aggressive intentions of Russian elite. I am absolutely permanent, representative of opposition of this establishment. But please, in the West, do not overestimate the negative role of Russia. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, but this is still satellite of big countries, big elites of imperialism. Thank you. Yes, and I'm sorry, it's 10 p.m. in Moscow. I have to move to another obligation, which I have to organize another conference in my country. So I'm very sorry for this, colleagues. It's too late because of all changes. I cannot participate more than 2 hours.
Alexander,
excuse me.
Thank you very much for presenting this talk to us. It's very, very interesting. We shall take it into account in our discussions. I hope we keep in touch. This discussion is very, very important. So even if you cannot continue with us now, perhaps you can continue later on and see how all this discussion develops. Again, thank you very much, Alexander.
Thank you, muchas gracias, and I will write my email in the chat, okay?
Okay.
To everybody.
Adios.
Goodbye, adios.
Okay. Entonces, Lo que sigue es una discusión general entre todo el público. Entonces, le damos la palabra a... Tenemos 24 participantes directamente en Zoom y sabemos que también hay participaciones a través de YouTube. Entonces, háganos llegar sus comentarios, sus preguntas. Por favor, tenemos un buen rato y en función del número de participantes, veremos cómo sigue la cuestión esta de esta mesa. Por favor, ¿quién pide la palabra? ¿Quién quiere decir algo? Todo el público. Okay, Cliff, por favor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, some very interesting presentations here. And I wanted to pick up on one particular point that, well, I guess, Sergio was talking about the Communist Manifesto, in which focuses very much on classes, class conflict as the moving force of history. Now, the question I have is to Radhika, who said that it's not only class conflict, it's not only classes that are the agents of history, but also nation states. And that seems like something of an amendment to what was originally part of what we understood, at least, as the core of Marxist thought. Certainly, the nation states have been very important in history and have been key players in imperialist conflicts. But as you expand on that, Radhika, I'd like you also to take into account, thinking about the point that I made, thinking about states as no longer being national states, nation states, but globalized states, states that are less oriented toward the interests of their national populations and more toward the interests of capital, which has become global in scope. And so it might be more appropriate to talk about the states as globalized states.
Okay. Celia, I don't know, Celia, ¿estás aquí? Necesitamos que abran los micrófonos de todo el mundo. No sé quién controla eso.
Oh, mine is open, but should we take more questions or shall I respond to Cliff?
Well, let's respond now and see if there is
Okay.
more and more questions and so forth. Please, Radhika.
So, yeah, great. Well, Cliff, thanks for your question. So you are asking, first of all, about how do we think of nations as equally important as classes in the history of socialism. And I'm speaking broadly as a Marxist, so I will refer to Marx, but I also feel that this is historically accurate. So basically, the dialectic of uneven and combined development, if you extend it and think about it more fully, in fact, what it does is it calls nations into being, because the moment you get a dominant capitalist power, which then essentially seeks to externalize its contradictions onto other territories, peoples who live in these territories face a choice. They will either organize themselves as nation states so that they may then, by developing the national economy, resist imperial power, or they may give in to imperial power. So this is what, for example, was true of Germany, the United States, and other such countries which industrialized beginning in the late 19th century. They were very clear that they did not wish to be agricultural appendages to Britain. Obviously, they were not colonized, so what they were suffering was really more the threat of domination and the beginnings of domination, and they pushed back. And what do you get? You get the German unification, you get the end of the Civil War in the United States, you get the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which constitute the modern nation states of these countries, and then they fight back. An inter-imperialist rivalry then leads to the First World War and what I call in my own writing the 30 Years crisis, because the First World War is umbilically connected to the Second World War. It is a single long period of crisis, which also is the peak of both imperialism and capitalism, which is a separate matter. So I would say, and I would like to share with you just one, I mean, I have shown in my writings a number of points that Marx makes about how for him nation states are important. For example, he is said to have argued that, you know, only imperialism will develop India, you know, as though he was some kind of a cosmopolitan endorsing imperialism. Or he's said to have argued that, you know, the artillery of cheap commodities will break down all Chinese walls. But if you actually read Marx carefully, even in the manifesto, there is a clarity about the central agency of nation states. But let me just show you this very interesting short passage. It occurs in his comments on Henry Carey, who was an American mercantilist economist, much like Friedrich List. And Marx's comments on this, and I cannot discuss it in great detail, but I would like to intrigue you enough that you will go back and read this. Let's just read this short piece. Marx says that Carey, you know, being a mercantilist and therefore a totally pro-capitalist thinker, he wants to argue that there are no contradictions or disharmonies in capitalism. For him, everything that happens within the nation state, therefore within the United States, is perfectly harmonious, fantastic, great, no class conflict, anything. The real conflicts begin at the international level. So this is what he's criticizing. And he says with Carey, the harmony of bourgeois relations of production ends with the most complete disharmony, that is contradiction, of these relations on the grandest terrain where they appear, the world market. So what does this tell you? First of all, the world market is the grandest terrain on which the contradictions of capitalism emerge. And what's more, they emerge there in their grandest development as the relations of producing nations. So nations nations are not only central and equally important as classes, but what begins, which has its roots in class contradictions, takes its fullest development in contradictions in the international relations of nations. All relations that appear harmonious to Carey within specific national boundaries appear disharmonious when they appear in the most developed form, as the international relations which produce English domination of the world market. And of course, what was Carey about? It was nothing more than about resistance to English domination on the world market. The concentration of capital within a country, the dissolving effect of this concentration present nothing but positive things to Carey. But the monopoly of concentrated English capital and its dissolving effect on smaller national capitals, at this point including the American, of other countries is disharmonious. I won't go on, but this is just to give you a very short and brief taste of what you may call. And I have also written an article which came out just a couple of months ago in Capital in Class, in which I further elaborate on this. And I've done a lot of other work precisely showing, because you see, unfortunately, there is a huge bias towards reading Marx in a certain way, and I've also written about this, which comes from neoclassical economics, which Marxist economists brought in as a sort of Trojan horse into the Marxist citadel. And that's what has caused a huge amount of problems, taking a globalization or even an imperialism and empire view of Marx. Marx endorsed none of these things. And so you have to see nations as equally important as states. Now, you made a second point, aren't nations globalized? I think you certainly, if you looked around, you can say, you know, what are the elites of, I don't know, name me a particularly abject imperialist lackey country. perhaps Brazil under Bolsonaro, or let me say, since I'm from there, India under Modi. You could not find more lackey nation than that. Of course, you will find such things, but you will also find a long and honorable record of countries that have resisted imperialist exploitation, beginning with Russia, beginning with China, beginning with a whole bunch of countries that did attempt, at least to some extent, to some significant extent, anti-imperialist action. And I think that they have had an effect, and we have to look at that. If we fail to look at that, if we keep saying we all have to do anti-capitalism, we are not going to get very far. Anti-capitalism will happen only hand in hand with anti-imperialism. The two are inseparable, and the one cannot be subordinated to the other. So that would be my answer. And I should also say, some of these points, many of these points are the essence of a manifesto, which I meant to share in my talk. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to the International Manifesto Group's manifesto, which cover many of these things. On that website, there is a Spanish version and a Portuguese version. I hope very much that people, and many other language versions. So I hope very much some of you will take the time to read it and respond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Radhika. Please, Sergio, tienes que, también mencionó Cliff, sobre tu concepción sobre el Estado mundial.
Me planteó a mí una pregunta, sino que...
¿Quieres decir algo, Sergio?
No entendí, si entendí nada más fue un comentario en torno a lo que yo dije. Marco. O sea, si pudiera entonces aclarar, si me hizo una pregunta, por favor que me la aclare, porque quizá no la entendí.
Bueno, hizo un comentario respecto a la forma. Entiendo que el concepto de Cliff no es tanto la formación de un Estado mundial, sino que se está globalizando el Estado. No sé si eso merece una discusión o no. La globalización del Estado o la formación de un Estado mundial.
O sea que él piensa, la pregunta es entonces que él plantea no que se está formando un Estado mundial, sino que se está globalizando el Estado mundial. Si entendemos, mira, para mi modo de entender, el Estado al que se refieren Marx y Engels es un Estado mundial. Ellos están pensando en el Estado burgués en su conjunto, pero piensan, creo yo, que ese Estado burgués, en el momento en el que ellos están haciendo su consideración, ese Estado burgués es un Estado burgués que está compuesto, que está integrado fundamentalmente, entre comillas, como la suma de todos los estados burgueses nacionales. Si lo que quiere decir Cliff es que ahora el Estado burgués toma la forma de un Estado burgués que trasciende de lo nacional, pues entonces es lo mismo que lo que yo estoy diciendo. Yo lo que digo es que en la actualidad el Estado burgués cada vez más deja de ser la suma, la mera suma, entre comillas, de todos los estados burgueses nacionales. sino que se va conformando va tomando nuevas formas que lo llevan a trascender de la mera forma de la suma de los estados burgueses nacionales. Es un estado burgués que trasciende cada vez más de lo nacional. Por ejemplo, decía yo, la ONU es una institución que trasciende de los estados burgueses nacionales. Pero no nada más la ONU, es de una gran importancia considerar todos los estados, todos los pactos, por ejemplo, los pactos militares habidos y por haber sobre que son a nivel internacional. Por ejemplo, me parece que en particular la OTAN es una institución que va integrando, que va conformando una parte, también va conformando al Estado burgués a nivel, que toma la forma, que toma una forma internacional que trasciende de lo nacional. La OTAN me parece que va siendo parte del del Estado burgués mundial. Y lo mismo me parece que es la organización esta de Shanghái y el AUKUS, los diversos pactos internacionales, los diversos pactos militares entre los diversos estados nacionales van formando, van integrando un estado burgués, una nueva forma del estado burgués que trasciende de las formas de la mera suma de los estados nacionales. Si Cliff se refiere a que eso es el estado globalizado, pues entonces creo que es otra forma de decir lo mismo. Es decir, yo de lo que hablo es de que el estado burgués mundial toma actualmente la forma de un estado mundial por su forma, no nada más por su contenido, como antes lo pensaban Marx y Engels. No sé si me expliqué. Espero haberme explicado.
Muchas gracias, Sergio. Entonces,
can I try to clarify?
Me habré dado.
Yeah, can I try to clarify a little bit?
Sí, claro.
The United Nations, I guess, comes the closest to what one might speak of as a composite of nation states. But the United Nations is not a governing body. It is not a global state. In fact, there is not a global state, but there are globalized states in the plural. That is, there are states that have been globalized in the sense that their political elites are oriented towards serving the interests of transnational capital, which is global in character. And these are states that historically were nation states, but have become less so with globalization and the growth of the transnational corporations. To take an example, Mexico. Mexico is a state that has been highly globalized as its political elite through NAFTA reoriented the economy toward global markets and investment by transnational corporations. The current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is trying to turn Mexico away from that neoliberal globalized direction. It is a conflict. It's not something that can be done easily. I mean, the process of globalizing a state is not something that is done and finished with for good, but it unleashes conflicts, contradictions within the society, and we're seeing a counter reaction to that globalization of the Mexican state by AMLO in the present. And I think that same kind of analysis could be applied to many other states that have become immersed in globalized capitalism. That immersion has moved them away from serving national interests, and that has given rise to contradictions within the society and reactions against it. I see that Radhika has her hand up. Maybe she wants to rejoin this discussion.
Please, Radhika.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is, what Cliff says has, as I've already said, I mean, I'm not entirely disagreeing with Cliff, but what I'm saying is that it can be thought of in a more, shall we say, dialectical fashion. So there are, I would say, at least three different sorts of forces that keep the nation state from being, in any simplistic sense, either globalized or completely anti-imperial or something. So what are those three things? Number one, from the point of view of imperialist capital, so the capital that has already benefited from the unevenness of capitalist development, the core country capitalists, well, if they created a single world state, there would be no outside into which to dump the consequences of the contradictions of capitalism. It is because capitalism is contradictory that its division in a multitude of nation states becomes inevitable. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that because if you then take charge, if you take responsibility for that outside, then you haven't got an outside. So that's the first reason. There must be some other state on which you can dominate and in which you can therefore subordinate. That is the urge of these capitalists. It is not to create a world state, it is to create a hierarchy of states. Secondly, within the non-dominant, that is to say, within the poor countries of the world, let's just say for simplicity's sake, the capitalist elites on the one hand need the state to manage their always problematic relations with metropolitan capital. And even among metropolitan countries, it looked for a while in the post-Second World War period as though all inter-imperialist contradictions had vanished, but they never had. The Europeans began to create the European Union precisely because they wished to create an entity that would rival in size and economic power that of the United States. Just to give you one example, France did not, France left NATO and rejoined much later, etc. There always have been inter-imperialist contradictions, and today they are resurfacing again in very interesting ways. So that's the second reason. And finally, there's a third reason. The third reason is that at the end of the day, in the nation state form is the only form within which the masses have any purchase over their elites. They can, their restiveness, their unrest, their mobilization, their demands often essentially discipline their elites, at least to some extent, in trying to do at least throwing some crumbs in the direction of the masses, and that requires also retaining the boundaries of the nation state, and therefore some combination of these three, particularly the second two, the need for the national elites to resist imperialist capital on their own account, which may not be very great, but then pulled along also by the masses and their demands. So I think all of these things create a extremely complex situation in which even the most, and in fact, precisely the most globalized forms of capital will also then create the resistance to it, because that globalized formation is imposing huge costs on the masses. So that creates then that dialectic. The masses will eventually say enough, and even if they don't say it in an organized way, even if they say it in an inchoate way, there has to be some response from the elite. So those are just some thoughts. I think the matter is not closed at all, but those are just some thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. We would like more interventions. I think it would be important to I give 5 to 10 more minutes for the public discussion so that we can sort of come to some sort of conclusions, which I think also are very important, and to see where to go from here. So please, would somebody else like to say something on this? Bob Stone, please.
You are muted.
You're muted, Bob. Por favor, los que están controlando la discusión podrían abrir los micrófonos porque no están abiertos los micrófonos a todos.
He's unmuted now.
Okay,
now
Bob,
he's muted
please.
himself again.
Can you open your Bob? Can you open your okay?
How's that?
Good.
Okay.
Yeah, fine. Please go ahead.
I have found this discussion extremely interesting and extremely.
We still can't hear you, Bob.
You can't hear me. Can't hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
I can't hear him.
I can hear you.
I cannot hear him.
Bob está hablando.
Cliff, can you hear?
I can hear.
Sergio, ¿lo escuchas a Bob?
Now he's muted again.
Tiene cerrado su micrófono. Abre el micrófono.
A ver.
No, Bob.
Por favor.
Okay.
Él lo tiene que hacer.
Abre, Bob, open your microphone.
Alguien que control.
Ya está abierto.
Okay, we hear now.
Unmute me, but
I
no
cannot hear.
Bob, please,
No, ya
continue.
está cerrado.
Continue, Bob. Betsy, you closed the microphone. Now it's open. Say something.
No, está cerrado.
Estamos teniendo dificultades. No sé qué pasa. A ver,
Está cerrado el micrófono de Bob.
Bob, can you say something?
Okay.
Okay, try
Is that
now.
better?
Yeah, that should
Yes.
work.
It's better now.
Oh, excuse me. Well, this is a symbol of it. I'm in Mexico profundo con conexión malo. I'm in deepest Mexico with a bad connection. I would like very much to participate in this discussion. It's utterly fascinating to me. I would like to read Radhika's contribution. I'd like to read Sergio's and Cliff's, and I appreciated so much Marco's introduction. And I would hope, here's my proposal, that we not leave this discussion at this point, but that we share our written comments with each other. Sasha, I would love to have Sasha's statement, and I'd like to have Radhika's. Can we please share each other's written contributions and meet again to discuss in much greater actual interface, please?
Okay, thank you, Bob. Actually, this would be the idea for the conclusions, to see how we can keep this discussion going, because of course it's impossible to reach some sort of conceptual conclusion in such a short time. We have to confront our ideas and so forth. We would like to continue with the discussion. So we shall try to present a plan at the end of this of our meeting. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I see very few people other than our participants taking part in the discussion. I would like to ask them if there is anything they would like to say or comment.
¿Se
Sergio.
puede ya del público o todavía es del panel?
No, es todo el público.
Ah, bueno. Entonces, después de que participe Sergio, pues ahí esté.
No, me puedo esperar. Me puedo esperar a que participe más.
Me parece importante escucharte primero. ¿Sí?
Bien, bien, bien. A ver, miren, yo en cierto sentido hago una analogía entre, por ejemplo, cómo se conformaron los estados nacionales europeos y el fenómeno que está ocurriendo actualmente. Que a mi modo de ver, el fenómeno que desde mi punto de vista está ocurriendo actualmente. Si ustedes, digamos, si lo recordamos, los estados europeos, por ejemplo, el Estado español se conformó a partir de una colectividad, digámoslo así, de feudos y de ciudades que iban conformándose dentro de los feudos, digámoslo así. Y esto dio lugar, pero en cierto modo, en la España medieval, se podía hablar de que en cierto modo el Estado era la suma, entre comillas, de los estados feudales. Se fue desarrollando el comercio, se fue desarrollando el mercado, tomando particular importancia el mercado nacional, porque entre otras cosas eso lo facilitaba el lenguaje que iba en proceso de formación también, ¿verdad? Y ocurre que se va creando una gran cantidad de nuevos nexos entre los diversos sectores de lo que ahora es el país España. Se van creando nuevos nexos comerciales, nexos industriales, nexos, una multitud de nexos, de los cuales que podríamos decir que es la base económica que da lugar a la formación, a una tendencia a la formación a partir de un solo Estado nacional. El Estado nacional, la monarquía española, es en cierto modo, como dicen Marx y Engels, tu piedra angular es la burguesía que se ha desarrollado dentro del mercado español. Y en ese sentido, el nuevo Estado español, la monarquía, es una superestructura nueva que se forma a partir de la base que consiste en el mercado nacional español, en la industria española, etcétera, etcétera. Y entonces se forma la monarquía española, que es una superestructura de una nueva base, que se ha desarrollado en España. En cierto modo, yo creo que se puede hacer una analogía. Actualmente, o no actualmente, en el siglo XIX, podemos decir, cometiendo, creo yo, un error no demasiado grande, podemos decir que el Estado mundial, porque Marx y Engels hablan de un Estado mundial, el Estado mundial se presenta, la forma que toma es la suma de los estados burgueses nacionales. No, no, es un poco, se me hace una cierta abstracción, pero no es totalmente exacto decir eso, pero es una cierta, una primera aproximación razonable. Ahora bien, se desarrolla una serie de nuevos fenómenos a nivel mundial. Uno de esos fenómenos son, desde luego, el primero y más importante, si ustedes quieren, es el desarrollo del mercado mundial. Y junto con el desarrollo del mercado mundial, se desarrolla todo el fenómeno que tanto estudia Lenin, como es el fenómeno de la exportación de capitales de unos países hacia otros. Y junto con eso va desarrollándose el fenómeno del desarrollo de las empresas transnacionales. Por todos lados se desarrollan empresas transnacionales de diverso tipo, industriales, comerciales, financieras. Todo esto, a mi modo de ver, va siendo una base económica para que sobre ella se vaya formando una nueva superestructura. Y esa superestructura, me parece, podría decirse que es un estado burgués mundial, que va tomando la forma ya no meramente de la suma de los estados burgueses nacionales, sino que la forma que toma va trascendiendo de la suma de los estados burgueses nacionales. Como dice Cliff, yo estoy de acuerdo con lo que dice Cliff, que la ONU solita, la ONU por sí misma, no es un estado global, pero creo que es una institución que es parte integrante del proceso. Y así como creo que la ONU es una institución para la formación de un estado burgués internacional, mundial por su forma, también creo que otro tipo de fenómenos que se van dando como con base en la base económica de la cual que he esbozado hace un momento, se va conformando también otro tipo de formaciones políticas, como es, por ejemplo, la Unión Europea, como es, por ejemplo, la OTAN, es otro tipo de institución, mientras que la OTAN es un acuerdo militar principalmente. La Unión Europea es otro tipo de institución, pero se van conformando una gran cantidad de formaciones estatales nuevas que trascienden de lo nacional. Todo eso, yo diría que es el proceso de formación de un Estado burgués mundial por su forma, ya no solamente por su contenido, como lo hablaban, creo yo, Marx y Engels, sino por su forma. Ese Estado burgués mundial está en desarrollo constante. Ahorita todavía es muy importante los estados nacionales. Todavía lo son. Pero creo yo que debemos considerar la tendencia. Y la tendencia es a la integración, creo yo, para formarse un solo estado burgués mundial por su forma. Es mi punto de vista. Eso es lo que quería decir.
Gracias. Cliff, we'll give you, please, por favor, please.
Okay.
You're the last one, okay? So that we can go to the next phase.
All right. Just to sort of pull together some things that have been said with regard to the United Nations and the global bourgeoisie. The World Economic Forum put out a very interesting document in 2010, I guess it was, talking about the United Nations. And I'd just like to quote from it. They said, the 1945 UN Charter explicitly identifies people or societies at large as the ultimate stakeholder of international governance, notwithstanding the role sovereign states play as essential actors in the international system. The state-based core of the system needs to be adapted to a more complex bottom-up world in which non-governmental actors, and they don't say explicitly who that is, non-governmental actors have become a more significant force. But what is also required is a corresponding sense of ownership in the health of the international system by these very non-state stakeholders, which until now have tended, with the notable exception of certain NGOs, to leave such matters entirely to the national governments. End quote. Now, as I read that statement, the non-governmental actors that have become a more significant force are the transnational corporations. They're certainly not NGOs, certainly not national populations. It is transnational corporations that in the era of globalization have become significant forces. And as the World Economic Forum envisions the global governance structure that they are aiming for, it is one in which those corporations will play a major role along with states, but it is the CEOs basically of transnational corporations that our global bourgeoisie sees as aiming for candidates for a dominant position in establishing new institutions of global governance.
Okay, thank you very much, Cliff. This is a very complex discussion. It's I think there are wonderful ideas on all parts. Unfortunately, we cannot continue the discussion here now at this moment. The plan we had was for all participants, that is the 5 that participated in the former panel and the 4 of this panel, if they would like, if any one of you would like to give a 3-minute conclusions as regards the discussion today and the formal, the general discussion. We would like 3 minutes for those who would like to say the last words, some sort of conclusion or proposals, please. So I would begin with, I don't know if you want to participate, or shall I ask each one of you what your idea as a general conclusion would be? 3 minutes, please. Can we begin with you, Bob?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, well, I'm fascinated by this, the very ending here. The people of the world have been shunted aside by nations and by states and by races, and divided in classes and developing them internationally, the same class divisions that Marx and Engels referred to. I think it's time for the people of the world to find their own voice. My intervention was that should be the response to omnicide is integral humanity, the workers of the world beginning to find a way to talk with each other. It's in principle possible for a factory in Korea to talk with a factory in Buenos Aires through the international machine translation possibilities available to us. I'd like you to think about that, but I'd mainly like to have these papers so I can read them and honestly respond to these brilliant interventions. What I've picked up from Sergio is wonderful stuff, but I'm only getting a little bit of it. So please excuse me.
Radhika, please, 3 minutes.
Thank you very, very much. So I also find this conversation very fascinating, and I also feel that this conversation is very necessary. I think we've really come at a time in the history of the world when action of the people is more urgent than ever, simply because the structures that have been created by capitalism are breaking down. They are breaking down in the core countries as well as in the periphery countries. They are breaking down in rich countries and poor countries. And at the same time, while I wouldn't go anywhere near to saying that everything is perfect in China or Cuba or wherever, the existing socialist countries do have a lot to teach us, and we need to look at it more closely. So let me also close by saying that I certainly think that we should discuss matters considerably more. I want to draw your attention back to the manifesto. The manifesto is here. It takes about an hour to read. I think it really pays reading. I think that this can be part of the mix of documents with which you can take discussion further, but I think we really need to discuss these things. And I just want to say one other thing, which is that I think a forum like this, which is an international forum, should really focus on forging international contacts, whereas obviously there are domestic forces that are working. You know, we can, while it would be great to talk to workers in the maquiladoras or in India or in China or Russia or wherever, I think that we are not going to be there to mobilize them. I think we need to connect with groups and organizations that are mobilizing them, that are trying to take the struggle forward. And I think something like the manifesto can be quite a good aid trying to do that. So I look forward to hearing from many of you. I've put the URL back in the chat again, and here is the manifesto, and you will see here that there are many translations already available, including, as I said, Spanish and Portuguese. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Betsy, is Betsy there?
Yes. Betsy, you're wanted. Do you have any final thoughts to convey to the group?
No, I don't. But I hope we can continue the conversation.
Have a seat here.
Hola, Marco. Hola a todos.
Betsy,
Espero que
your 3-minute conclusions, please, on the discussion in general.
Well, I'd like to say that I hope we can continue this discussion and that
We have the written papers.
and we have our written papers that we can circulate, of course. And I know you're going to make an ebook out of it. And I think among all of these conversations and conversations that we're having with other people and other, you know, like-minded people in other arenas,
South Africa.
there is a lot of ferment and a lot going on, and people are focusing now on uniting more and more to push forward the changes that are so desperately needed. And so I would like to help participate in that and encourage that. And
And thank you, Marco, for being such a wonderful initiator and stimulator of this dialogue. You've brought out wonderful things. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Betsy, Bob. So I see that some of the other participants are no longer with us, but we have Sergio here, who would be the last one from these 9 people, the group. Por favor, Sergio, adelante.
¿Puedo hablar, Marco?
Sí, por favor, sigue.
Bueno, yo nada más lo que quiero señalar es un poco la intención de por qué me parece importante, en particular, el considerar ese proceso, esa tendencia hacia la formación de un Estado burgués mundial por su forma, lo que creo que es una tendencia. Entre otras, una de las razones por las cuales me parece muy importante es porque me parece que a nivel mundial hay, con el desarrollo del capitalismo a nivel mundial, es en el fondo se va transformando cada vez más en un verdadero, como dije hace un rato, juego de suma cero. Una condición antagónica entre el proletariado internacional y la gran burguesía mundial. El problema original que hubo, que llevó a que las revoluciones como la tenían pensada, la revolución como la tenían pensada Marx y Engels, la revolución en cierto modo concentrada en los estados capitalistas avanzados de su época, y en forma relativamente inmediata, y que fue un claro error de cálculo de Marx y de Engels, se transforma en realidad. Si vemos las cosas, si vemos el problema en su conjunto, si no nada más vemos a los países capitalistas avanzados, sino sino que vemos también a toda la sociedad capitalista en su conjunto, esa sociedad capitalista se va integrando cada vez más, y aquí también cuenta mucho el proletariado de los países atrasados. El proletariado de los países atrasados es una fuerza, a mi modo de ver, de una gran importancia y que creo que cada vez es más combativa. Yo entiendo que muchos de estos aspectos se expresan en particular, por ejemplo, en los movimientos migratorios. En los movimientos migratorios y en otra clase de situaciones. Entonces, si consideramos que la sociedad capitalista se va convirtiendo en una unidad, en una sola unidad, que es un juego, como digo, de suma cero, es decir, que es una sociedad en donde se presenta un antagonismo entre el proletariado mundial y la burguesía mundial, pues eso da lugar a que concibamos una estrategia y una táctica proletarias en condiciones nuevas. Y eso me parece que es de una gran importancia considerarlo como una idea fundamental para trazar pues los planes de lucha del proletariado internacional en las condiciones actuales. Ya, eso es lo que quería decir. Espero haberme dado a entender.
Bueno, pues me parece que no hay más.
Can I just add?
Yes, please, Cliff, por favor.
Can I add just one very brief closing comment to this? We are in agreement that this discussion needs to be continued and broadened, including more. There's much to talk about. We focus very much today in the evolution of the of states under global capitalism. But there are other themes that came up in earlier discussions that also we need to not lose sight of. In his opening summary of the last panel, Marcos referred to China and the relation between the US and China, which is many see as a potential imperialist rivalry between these two countries, whether that's an accurate portrayal of it or not, but that's clearly something that we also need to discuss. And there are many other issues too in this ongoing discussion of imperialism today.
Okay, thank you very much, Cliff. Then we have a, well, I have about, bueno, voy a hablar en español, por favor. Voy a hacer un pequeño resumen y una propuesta. La propuesta es presentarles a todos ustedes un método para tratar de continuar la discusión. Este es mi propósito en este momento, tomando en cuenta todo lo que se ha dicho en los dos paneles. Entonces, en primer lugar, me parece que sería interesante continuar la discusión con la siguiente temática. Sería importante ver si están de acuerdo o habría que modificar algo. La temática sería el marco teórico para la lucha mundial contra el imperialismo, el capitalismo y el Estado y la organización de los proletarios del mundo. Eso sería la temática. más o menos, ¿no?
Sí.
Dirigido, la idea sería dirigirlo a los militantes, trabajadores e intelectuales de todo el mundo. Repito, a los militantes, trabajadores e intelectuales de todo el mundo. El objetivo es la organización, participar en la organización de los trabajadores a nivel mundial. Nos gustaría que fuese dentro de la cobertura, dentro de la estructura de estos encuentros de la economía mundial de los trabajadores, con la posibilidad de ampliar a diferentes redes, etcétera. El método que proponemos sería, pues evidentemente, por el momento, hacer una serie de discusiones, etcétera, a través de Zoom, mediante el Zoom, que es lo que más a mano tenemos, y pasos importantes para esto sería la elaboración de listas de correos electrónicos o de teléfonos para integrar un WhatsApp del grupo, de tal forma de poder establecer contactos a nivel mundial, empezando con los que se han reunido aquí, los compañeros y compañeras de la red de economía de los trabajadores y las redes propias del Centro para la Justicia Global y nuestro seminario de discusiones para ampliar pues estas listas y ser lo más inclusive posible. Tratar de la manera más pronta posible, planear una siguiente reunión. No me atrevo a plantear una fecha porque pues sería importante ponernos de acuerdo, digamos, para poder realmente presentar ideas nuevas, tratar de establecer temas más concretos, etcétera, dentro de la temática general. Entonces, esa es la propuesta general que yo quisiera hacer a nuestros participantes el día de hoy, y lo que me gustaría saber es, ¿están de acuerdo más o menos con esto? Y si es así, si hay alguna objeción respecto a cualquiera de los puntos establecidos, pues por favor, opinen sobre esto ahora.
Cliffy Radica.
Sorry, please. Sorry.
Would you like to say something,
Do we need
Radhika?
to translate?
I already did. Did I not already do that?
Sorry?
Please, what was the question again, please?
Bob, what would you like to ask Radhika?
I just wanted to ask you to convey what you just said in English too.
I think it was
Radhika.
translated.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Did you get the message? Did you get the proposal that I made, Radhika?
Sorry, I haven't got any message.
Did you hear it in English?
Yes, I did. I think so.
Good, good.
Excuse
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think it's a good,
No, and I liked it. I agreed with you.
I agree.
we should,
I also think though that it's well, we will proceed step by step. It's what you're proposing is a lot of work, but let's proceed step by step.
Okay. I think the first step would be, first of all, to, I don't know if it's possible, or how would you propose that we organize some sort of organizing committee or what?
Yeah, I'm also slightly handicapped in this because I'm thinking of this as a general discussion of a theoretical sort. But clearly, I think you are coming from a background, and I wasn't able to attend the first event. So what is the overall practical aim that we are trying to achieve?
The practical end would be to participate in the global organization of the working class movement, the working classes movement, both radical, progressive intellectuals, and directly the workers' movement. We would like to contact trade unions, cooperative organizations. So this is very much the reason which leads us to want to maintain the cover of the workers' economy gatherings, because they are a mixture of intellectual and practical work amongst the workers.
Right. So I would say that certainly, I mean, I'm happy to participate in any theoretical discussions you have, but let me also underline the critical importance of the manifesto. I think if you take a look at it, and maybe it's a short document. If you simply say, let's all read this and discuss it, and we're not saying everybody should agree with every last dot and comma and so on. But if you read it, we can discuss it and we can see how it and other related things can help us advance precisely the cause of working people around the world. This is the key. This is the goal of the manifesto as well. And it is your goal. So perhaps it can be a place where we can meet. I think if we have a session on that, I think we would I think we would really all benefit. It would focus the discussion, because one of the things is, on the one hand, seeing so many views expressed is exciting, very exhilarating, as Bob said, but also at the same time, after a point, we should focus on something. So maybe the next thing can be a focus.
So the focus would be on the Communist Manifesto?
No, on the manifesto that I have shared twice now in the thing. Okay. It's called Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism. And it is precisely one that puts both class and nation and their struggles into the larger picture of the contest between capitalism and socialism, one which I think now we are at a moment when the advance of socialism is easier today in many ways. And I think that we should all, be pushing at the open door. The door is already opening a bit. We should be pushing at it. I think this is the key thing.
Yeah, I agree that discussions will be most fruitful if they have a focus. Our discussion today had a focus, and we were able to get into things in some depth as a result. And having a discussion around the manifesto that Radhika has been involved in, I think would be a very good way to move forward. So I propose that that we all read that and gather next to discuss it.
I think that would be fantastic. And I can bring along a couple of other people as well who have contributed to it in a very critical fashion. And I think, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
I would agree completely. I think this is a wonderful step because it's very concrete. We don't have to fish around our heads and see what we can discuss, but I think this is a very good idea. I don't know the rest of the participants and those who are listening, if they are in agreement with this.
Bob and I think that would continuation point.
Okay. Sergio, ¿te parece un buen punto de partida?
Me parece bien, estoy de acuerdo.
Celia, what do you think?
Bueno, pues de acuerdo en la necesidad de continuar, ¿no? Esta discusión de la manera como lo están proponiendo, me parece que es lo que sigue. Así que, bueno, en virtud de que el tiempo ya se agotó, ¿no? De este panel, pues no quedaría más que, pues, agradecer a todas y a todos este importante tema, y me parece sumamente estimulante el que se haya también propuesto la continuidad y una manera de hacerlo. Y también celebro el fortalecimiento de los vínculos con el Centro para la Justicia Global.
Y ahora con el Grupo Manifiesto de...
Claro,
de
todo este crecimiento,
¿verdad?
esta, como decían ahora, ¿no? Hacerlo un punto de atracción, ¿no? De un punto de encuentro, como es lo que nosotros nos gusta más hacer. Así que hasta pronto y muchos abrazos. Y gracias, Marco, por tan espléndido trabajo.
Ok, nada más. Una última cuestión antes de que nos despidamos todo. Entonces, me gustaría plantear la forma de organizar lo siguiente, que el Centro para la Justicia Global, que el Grupo Manifiesto con el que trabaja Radica, que nuestro seminario en el que participo, y por supuesto el Encuentro Internacional, la red internacional de la economía de los trabajadores, que estos sean los cuatro grupos que trabajemos juntos para realizar las siguientes encuentros, publicaciones, etcétera, etcétera. No sé si están de acuerdo todos. Entonces, que cada uno de estos grupos, bueno, ya estamos de acuerdo en que la siguiente plática de discusión sería sobre el manifiesto que plantea Radica. Entonces, vayamos caminando hacia eso y que cada uno de estos centros organice a sus redes, etcétera, para que la participación sea lo más amplia posible. Y bueno, por supuesto, incluir a Alexander Pusgalin, que tuvo que abandonar la discusión, pero incluirlo a él. Y bueno, y hay otras personas que pueden ser muy importantes, ¿verdad? Me parecería importante conseguir personas de Cuba, de Venezuela, de una serie de países de América Latina que están dando la batalla. Y también sería muy importante incluir a personas de China, de India, de estos otros, bueno, vaya, de centros importantes, que sería importante tomar en cuenta sus puntos de vista para la discusión general, ¿verdad? Que no sea eurocéntrica, norteamericanocéntrica, sino que sea una verdadera perspectiva mundial la que vayamos desarrollando.
Mexicanocéntrica.
Y mexicanicéntrica. Entonces las invito
No
a
sea
todos y a todas.
mexicanocéntrica.
Ok. Que sea
quiero aumentar también la perspectiva de este nuevo campo de diálogo mundial que está construyéndose. El grupo Manifesto de Radica, también el grupo de Progressive Internacional Progresista, es la versión de antiguo comunista internacional, pero ahora en nuestro nuevo siglo, construir un diálogo internacional. No queremos queremos estar abiertos a todas formas de este diálogo, ¿verdad?
Perfecto, Bob. Entonces, solo lo último, Radica, Betsy, Bob, Cliff y Sergio, que hagamos próximamente una reunión interna de estos centros para organizar la siguiente discusión, la siguiente discusión general. ¿Les parece correcto?
Ándale.
Ok, perfecto.
Muy bien, muy
Muy
bien.
bien. Pues muchas gracias por
Viva.
todos, a todos
Muchas
nuestros
gracias.
públicos y a todos los participantes, y nos vemos próximamente. Gracias, Celia.
Ándale.
Pronto.
Bye bye.
Gracias, compañeros
Pronto.
del ESME, por la transmisión y todo el apoyo que están dando a esto. ¿Ok?
Qué bueno verles, compañeros.
Ok,
Hasta
pues.
pronto, gracias a Raúl,
vemos.
igual a Desme, al equipo de interpretación, que son pilares fundamentales de todo esto.
Gracias a
Gracias,
ellos,
fue
a los
fabuloso,
intérpretes.
fabuloso.
Mucho trabajo. Gracias.
Bueno, y hasta hubo muchos saludos en YouTube y por acá también. Entonces, bueno.
Bueno, hasta luego entonces.
Saludos.
Hasta luego.
Ok, adiós.